The Nazi scientist who built America's dreams, the man who put Americans on the moon, supervised the deaths of 20,000 slave laborers. NASA gave him ticker tape parades. The Soviets, they got the leftovers. So how did the architect of Hitler's vengeance weapons become America's space hero, while his victims rotted in unmarked graves? The answer reveals one of the Cold War's darkest bargains, a deal so morally compromised that the U.S. government kept it classified for decades. This is the story of how Nazi war criminals became American patriots, and why the Soviets, despite capturing Berlin, ended up with second-rate engineers while their enemies welcomed the masterminds. The boy who dreamed of rockets, Wernher von Braun, wasn't supposed to become a monster. Born into Prussian aristocracy in 1912, young Wernher was obsessed with the stars. At 13, he strapped fireworks to his toy wagon and launched it down a Berlin street, terrifying pedestrians and earning his first arrest. His mother, recognizing genius rather than delinquency, gave him a telescope. From that moment, von Braun had a singular vision. He would send humanity to the moon. By 1932, at just 20 years old, he was leading Germany's rocket development program. He was brilliant, charismatic, impossibly ambitious. He saw rockets as humanity's gateway to the cosmos, vehicles of exploration that would unite mankind in wonder. The universe, he believed, was waiting. Then Hitler came to power. The Nazis didn't care about the moon. They wanted weapons. Von Braun faced a choice: abandon his life's work or build rockets for the regime. He chose the rockets. In 1937, he joined the Nazi Party. By 1940, he'd become an SS officer. He would later claim these were merely formalities, bureaucratic necessities to secure funding. But the documents tell a different story. Von Braun wasn't just compliant. He was enthusiastic. Pinemund. Where dreams became weapons, the German government poured unlimited resources into the Pinemund research facility on the Baltic coast. Here, von Braun assembled the greatest rocket engineering team ever assembled. They had one goal: create a weapon that could strike London from German soil. On October 3, 1942, they succeeded. The A-4 rocket, later renamed the Vergeltungswaffe II, or V2, meaning vengeance weapon, became the world's first object to reach space, climbing to an altitude of 189 kilometers before arcing back to Earth. Von Braun reportedly celebrated by saying, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." He meant it as a joke. He still dreamed of Mars. But the V2 wasn't landing on Mars. It was landing on London, Antwerp, and dozens of civilian targets across Allied territory. Between September 1944 and March 1945, over 3,000 V2 rockets slammed into cities at 5 times the speed of sound. No warning, no defense, just sudden, apocalyptic destruction. Nearly 9,000 civilians died in the attacks, killed by the rocket von Braun designed. Yet those deaths represent only a fraction of the V2's true body count. Middlework, the factory of death. As Allied bombing intensified, Hitler ordered rocket production moved underground. The regime selected an abandoned gypsum mine in the Harz Mountains and transformed it into Middlework, the Central Works, a subterranean factory where the V2 would be mass-produced. The workers weren't volunteers. They were concentration camp prisoners, primarily from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora camp. Over 60,000 prisoners passed through Middleworks tunnels during the war's final years. They worked 16-hour shifts in near-total darkness, breathing rock dust and chemical fumes, sleeping in freezing bunkers where disease spread like wildfire. Von Braun visited Middlework regularly. He toured the production lines, reviewed manufacturing processes, and personally selected skilled prisoners to solve technical problems. He saw the skeletal workers, the brutal beatings, the bodies of those who collapsed from exhaustion. Survivors later testified that von Braun was present when prisoners were hanged from cranes as warnings to others. He saw everything. The numbers are staggering. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died building V2 rockets, more than twice the number killed by the rockets themselves. They died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and execution. They died so von Braun's dream could become Hitler's weapon. After the war, von Braun would claim ignorance. He said he didn't know about the conditions, didn't understand the slave labor system, couldn't have prevented it even if he had known. But the documents prove otherwise. In 1944, von Braun personally requested additional prisoners from Buchenwald concentration camp to accelerate production. He signed the requisition forms. He knew exactly what he was requesting. So how did this man, this architect of mechanized death, become an American hero? The surrender. Choosing America's embrace. By April 1945, Germany's collapse was inevitable. Von Braun faced 3 options: surrender to the advancing Soviets, fall into British hands, or somehow reach the Americans. The choice wasn't difficult. The Soviets had suffered devastating losses from German aggression. They would want revenge. The British had endured years of V-2 bombardment. They would want justice. The Americans? Von Braun gambled they would want rockets. He gathered his top engineers, destroyed sensitive documents, and led a carefully orchestrated escape south toward American lines. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's brother Magnus approached American soldiers with a rehearsed speech in broken English. "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." The Americans couldn't believe their luck. They'd captured Hitler's rocket genius before the Soviets even knew he was gone. Within weeks, von Braun was in American custody, being debriefed by military intelligence. Within months, he was on a ship to the United States, along with hundreds of his engineers and 14 tons of V-2 documentation. The program was called Operation Paperclip, and it remains one of the most morally compromised decisions in American history. Operation Paperclip, America's devil's bargain. The official story was simple. America needed German scientific expertise to counter Soviet threats. The reality was far more calculated. President Truman had explicitly ordered that no Nazi war criminals or active Nazi Party members be brought to America. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency simply ignored him. They systematically falsified records, expunged Nazi Party memberships, and sanitized SS affiliations. Von Braun's file was scrubbed clean, his SS membership downgraded to nominal, his presence at Middlework described as incidental, his role in prisoner requisitions erased entirely. Why the cover-up? Because America's military establishment had made a calculation. Nazi crimes were in the past, but Soviet rockets were the future. If the Soviets acquired Germany's rocket scientists first, American cities could face the same fate as London. The moral mathematics were brutal but simple. Better to forgive war crimes than lose the Cold War before it even began. By 1946, von Braun and over 1,600 German scientists were working for the U.S. military. They were given comfortable homes, generous salaries, and eventually American citizenship. Von Braun settled in Huntsville, Alabama, where he became a celebrity. He appeared on Disney television programs, explaining rocket science to American children. He wrote books about space colonization. He became the public face of American ambition, the genius who would deliver President Kennedy's promise to reach the moon. The 20,000 dead prisoners at Middlework were never mentioned. Stalin's fury. The Soviets get second-string engineers. Meanwhile, in the smoking ruins of Berlin, Stalin was furious. Soviet forces had captured Peenemünde and Middlework, but they'd arrived too late. Von Braun was gone. The Americans had taken the best engineers, the most advanced documentation, and even disassembled V-2 rockets to ship back to the United States. What the Soviets found were empty tunnels, scattered papers, and second-tier engineers who hadn't made von Braun's escape list. Stalin ordered his intelligence services to round up every German rocket expert they could find, engineers, technicians, even factory workers who'd assembled V-2 components. They captured thousands, but these weren't the masterminds. These were the supporting cast. The best they found was Helmut Grotrup, a talented engineer but nowhere near von Braun's genius. The Soviets initially treated Grotrup well, offering him luxury apartments and research facilities, desperately hoping he possessed secrets comparable to those now working for America. He didn't. Grotrup was competent, but he wasn't von Braun. The gap would prove decisive. Korolev. Genius forged in the gulag while America imported Nazi engineers. The Soviet space program had to rely on its own talent that Stalin had nearly destroyed. Sergei Korolev was the Soviet Union's greatest rocket engineer, but few knew his name. In 1938, during Stalin's Great Purge, Korolev had been arrested on fabricated charges, tortured by the secret police, and sentenced to years in the Kolyma Gulag, one of the deadliest labor camps in human history. He survived by sheer will, working as an engineer in the camp's gold mines, designing equipment in exchange for extra bread rations. By the time Korolev was released in 1944, his teeth had been knocked out during interrogation, his jaw permanently damaged, his body wrecked by years of starvation and forced labor. But his mind was intact, and he was determined to prove Soviet engineering could match and surpass anything the West could produce. Stalin assigned Korolev to lead Soviet rocket development, working with the captured German engineers. It was humiliating for Korolev. He'd suffered in the Gulag while these men had worked for Hitler, yet now he had to learn from them. He studied Grotrup's work intensely, extracting every piece of V-2 knowledge, but he knew they were working from an inferior foundation. By 1946, Stalin had seen enough. He ordered all German engineers sent back to East Germany or deeper into the Soviet Union, isolated from cutting-edge research. Stalin didn't trust them, and more importantly, Soviet pride demanded a purely Russian space program. From that point forward, Korolev would have to innovate on his own. The Americans had von Braun and his dream team. The Soviets had one gulag survivor and second-hand information. The race begins. Borrowed evil versus homegrown genius. The space race wasn't just about rockets. It was about legitimacy. Both superpowers needed to prove their system superior, their ideology destined for victory. And in the 1950s, the scoreboard was shocking. Despite starting with Nazi war criminals and unlimited resources, America fell behind. Badly. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. America was stunned. How had the Soviets, supposedly backward and technologically inferior, beaten von Braun and his German team? For months later, America's first satellite attempt, the Vanguard rocket, exploded on the launch pad in a humiliating fireball broadcast on live television. The press called it Kaputnik. Then came 1961. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting Earth aboard Korolev's Vostok spacecraft. America was in panic. President Kennedy demanded action. Von Braun promised he could deliver victory, not in Earth orbit where the Soviets had won, but on the moon itself. The question nobody in Washington wanted to ask: was the Nazi genius actually worth the moral compromise? The conspiracy of silence. Why America looked away. Here's what makes Operation Paperclip truly disturbing. It wasn't a rogue operation. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and involved the highest levels of American government. The JOA didn't just falsify a few records. They created an entire apparatus for denying Nazi atrocities. When Holocaust survivors contacted American authorities with testimony about von Braun's presence at Middlework, their letters were filed away. When journalists asked about German scientists' wartime activities, military officials provided sanitized biographies. When French and British allies demanded war crimes prosecutions, American diplomats claimed insufficient evidence. The conspiracy required cooperation across multiple agencies: military intelligence, the State Department, the FBI, and eventually NASA itself. Thousands of officials knew the truth. They chose silence. Why? The Cold War demanded it. In the binary logic of superpower competition, you were either strong or dead. Moral qualms were luxuries America couldn't afford. The Soviets had nuclear weapons and were developing ICBMs. If Nazi expertise could counter that threat, then Nazi expertise would be embraced. But was it even necessary? This is where the conspiracy deepens. The uncomfortable truth. America didn't need von Braun. Here's the fact that challenges the entire justification for Operation Paperclip. Korolev beat von Braun anyway. Despite working with inferior resources, despite starting from scattered V-2 remnants, despite years lost to Stalin's gulag, Korolev achieved every major space milestone first. First satellite. First animal in space. First human in space. First spacewalk. First spacecraft to another planet. Von Braun, with every advantage, funding, facilities, and entire team of experienced engineers, couldn't match him. Not until 1969, when Apollo 11 finally landed on the moon, did America achieve a clear space victory. And even that wasn't purely von Braun's triumph. By then, NASA had developed its own engineering expertise. Many key Apollo innovations came from American engineers who'd learned on the job, not from recycled Nazi designs. So what did Operation Paperclip actually accomplish? It gave America a head start in missile technology, which proved valuable during the Cold War arms race. But for space exploration, the public justification for importing Nazi scientists, the program was arguably unnecessary. America could have developed its own rocket expertise, as the Soviets proved was possible. Instead, America chose the shortcut, and the shortcut required forgiving mass murder. The final question: was it worth it? Wernher von Braun died in 1977, celebrated as a visionary. His funeral was attended by NASA officials, astronauts, and politicians. He received tributes from presidents and medals from scientific organizations. American schoolchildren learned his name as the father of the space age. The 20,000 prisoners who died building his rockets have no memorial. Most remain in unmarked graves near Middlework. Their names are forgotten, their suffering erased from the triumphalist narrative of space exploration. This is Operation Paperclip's lasting legacy, not just that America forgave Nazi war crimes, but that it rewrote history to make those crimes disappear. Von Braun became a hero because America needed a hero, regardless of the bodies buried in his past. The Soviets, meanwhile, built their space program on different principles, not because they were more moral, but because they had no choice. Stalin's paranoia and pride demanded a purely Soviet achievement. So Korolev and his team innovated, suffered, and ultimately triumphed through sheer determination. The paradox is inescapable. America, The victor, claiming moral authority over Nazi Germany, embraced Nazi criminals to win the peace. The Soviets, despite their own totalitarian brutality, rejected Nazi assistance and still won the early space race. So here's the question nobody in Washington wanted to answer. If the goal was reaching space, did America need to make a deal with the devil? Or was Operation Paperclip always less about necessity and more about expedience? A moral failure disguised as strategic genius? The rockets von Braun built did eventually reach the moon. But they were built on foundations of slave labor, launched from the career of a war criminal, and justified by a conspiracy of silence that continues today. America got its space program. It just had to ignore 20,000 bodies to achieve it. Was it worth it? That depends on whether you believe the ends justify the means, and whether you think the ends even required those particular means in the first place. The Soviets proved there was another path. America chose not to take it.